serve as co-president of Asian Crossroads at Yale, the university's largest student organization dedicated to fostering dialogue on Central Asia. Our mission is twofold: to serve as a cultural hub of the university's Central Asian community, and to engage in thoughtful discussion on Central Asia's role in global history and geopolitics within the greater Yale community. Before we begin, I'd like to extend our thanks to the Alexander Hamilton Society for partnering with us in promoting this event. We're also deeply grateful to the Macmillan Center, the Edward J. and Dorothy Clark Kemp Memorial Fund, and the Central Asian Initiative for sponsoring today's program. In particular, we'd like to thank Professor Brunson, Carly Coble, Christina Andriadis, and Professor Rosine for their invaluable support in making this event possible. Although Central Asia remains little known to most Americans, the United States has provided consistent aid and assistance to the region since the Republic's first gained independence in 1991. Throughout the 1990s, a combination of economic support and efforts to strengthen democratic institutions made modest yet meaningful contributions to the lives of Central Asian people. However, while America sought to build constructive relationships, its progress has been challenged by persistent Russian media campaigns. These narratives have portrayed the United States as exploitive, successfully undermining America's ability to present itself as a reliable and trustworthy partner. In recent years, this challenge has been further compounded by significant cuts to foreign assistance programs, including the dismissal of key staff in USAID. The result has been a weakening of America's presence and influence, just as Russia continues to entrench its own. So this now raises a critical question for us today. What role should the United States play in Central Asia? And more importantly, what steps can America take to effectively counter Russian soft power in the region where trust, perception, and partnership matter most? Now, we're very lucky today to have two of the best experts here with us. Ambassador Dan Rosenblum is one of America's leading foreign policy experts on Central Asia. A proud member of Yale's class of 1981, Ambassador Rosenblum, 84.
I seem older than I already am.
There's some brief chance to that. Ambassador Rosenblum dedicated the majority of his career to foreign assistance and diplomacy in the post-Soviet states. He's played a key role in designing and implementing multi-billion-dollar assistance packages to Georgia in 2008, Kyrgyzstan in 2010, and Ukraine in 2014. He later served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs from 2014 to 2019, the U.S. Ambassador to Uzbekistan from 2019 to 2022, and most recently, the U.S. Ambassador to Kazakhstan from 2022 to 2025 under President Joe Biden. And after a distinguished 28-year career, he has since retired from the Foreign Service. Professor Claire Rosine is an assistant professor and director of undergraduate studies in the Yale Departments of Slavic Languages and Literatures. Raised in Uzbekistan during the early 2000s, she witnessed the country's early years of independence firsthand. The daughter of NGO workers, she's attended Uzbek Russian schools before earning her BA, MA, and PhD at the University of Chicago. Along with Professor Nari Sharapayev, she is one of Yale's leading scholars on Central Asian culture and history, and a core contributor to the Central Asian Initiative Steering Committee, led by Professor Molly Brunson. Today's event, accompanied by a beautiful lunch, will feature three components. First, a 20 to 30-minute keynote address by Ambassador Rosenblum. Second, a 30-minute moderated discussion with Professor Rosine. And finally, 30 minutes of open Q&A with the audience. And with that, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Dan Rosenblum.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. Okay, that's a good height. It's amazing to be back at Yale today, almost exactly 45 years to the day that I matriculated as a newly minted member of the class of 1984. Now, I might have told you that I had a vision back then that I would return one day as a speaker after a long career as a US diplomat, but I didn't, because that would be disinformation. The truth is that I don't really remember what I was thinking. Most likely I was trying not to get lost on campus as a freshman as I wandered around, maybe obsessing over my course decisions. But I do have one retained memory from those first weeks at Yale, and that was our freshman class welcoming ceremony in Woolsey Hall, and the speech by then President Benno Schmidt. Now, again, I'm a little fuzzy on the contents of the speech, but I do recall one detail. President Schmidt made repeated reference to George Orwell's 1984, probably something along the lines of, class of '84, use your privilege that you've been given of a liberal arts education to ensure that our world doesn't become like the world of 1984. Lux et veritas as the antidote to darkness and lies. 45 years later, we've come full circle. Once again, people are looking back at Orwell's portrayal of a world where the ministry of truth tells lies, where 2 + 2 = 5, and saying, something feels familiar here. And this state of affairs inspired me to talk to you today about a particular manifestation of that 2 + 2 = 5 phenomenon, which is, as Benjamin said, information warfare based on lies being waged against the United States by Russia. Its impact on our diplomatic missions, especially in Central Asia, and how we can combat it. Now, while my memories of freshman year at Yale are kind of murky, I have a much clearer memory of an event that took place a little over 6 years ago. May 9th, 2019 was definitely one of the top 5 most exciting and meaningful days of my life, right up there with my wedding and my bar mitzvah. That day, I took the oath of office as the newly appointed US ambassador to Uzbekistan in front of several hundred well-wishers in the State Department's ornate Ben Franklin reception room. That day, I made a speech about how I planned to carry out my duties as ambassador. I talked about how I would develop a relationship based on trust and mutual respect with the government and the citizens of Uzbekistan, and how my top priority would be the safety and well-being of my embassy staff and American citizens living there, which because of COVID ended up being a much bigger part of my job than I ever expected. I also talked that day about my plans to promote our companies, US companies' exports and investments, about how I could conduct a dialogue with the government about human rights and fundamental freedoms. And I talked about how we would partner with Uzbekistan to address common threats like terrorism and trafficking in drugs and human beings. Frankly, this was all pretty standard stuff for an ambassador about to take up his duties. And no doubt, the family members, dear friends, and valued colleagues who gathered that day to honor me assumed I would be carrying out a pretty standard diplomatic assignment. But how wrong they were. Little did they know that I was heading to Central Asia with another agenda, a highly secret one. My poor, naive friends and colleagues didn't know that I was the mastermind of an elaborate plan to stir up civil unrest in the hopes it would lead to the collapse of governments and the installation of American puppet regimes. They had no idea my nefarious plan would be carried out by the US Agency for International Development by giving money to civil society organizations who would actually carry out the revolution. My loved ones didn't have a clue that I would also be overseeing a network of bioweapons laboratories established by the US Department of Defense for the purpose of introducing specially engineered, extremely dangerous pathogens into Central Asian human and animal populations. Nor would they have any reason to suspect that 3 years later, I would move to Astana, armed with a classified plan to establish a brand new NATO training center in Almaty, bringing the Western military alliance to Russia's doorstep. Oh, and one other thing that my friends and family didn't know about my new diplomatic assignment: all of my secret plans had a single overriding goal, not even related to Central Asia: to weaken Russia. Spoiler alert, The actual reason that none of my friends, families, or colleagues knew about my real agenda as ambassador to Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan is that everything I just said is false. Each of the secret plans I just listed is completely fictitious, made up of whole cloth. And yet, every one of those lies was presented as fact through articles appearing on web-based news sites supported by the Russian government and its proxies, and aimed at the Central Asian media market throughout the 6 years that I served in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. A seemingly endless array of media outlets with names like Sputnik, Stan Radar, and EA Daily pushed out such stories on a daily basis. These outlets, financed and supplied with content by the Russian state, represent just a tiny part of an enormous Russian disinformation machine that every single day spews out hateful lies about the United States and its activities around the world. In Central Asia, these so-called news stories would later be reposted through the popular social media platform Telegram, thereby reaching a much larger audience. And by the way, we don't really know how large, because given the opaque nature of these media organizations, it's virtually impossible to find reliable metrics of the readership. Now, today, I don't intend to describe the Russian disinformation machine in detail. Many others have done that separately, and there's plenty of things to look up. And for those who want to learn more, I highly recommend a report produced by the RAND Corporation in 2016, and it holds up really well, even though it's 9 years old. This paper, in fact, was the source for the phrase "Firehose of falsehood" in the title of my talk today, as it was advertised. The RAND authors aptly describe the Russian technique of flooding the zone with partial truths or completely made-up stories, sometimes to create an alternative narrative that suits Russia's domestic or foreign policy needs, sometimes just to sow enough confusion that it becomes impossible to sort out fact from fiction. As the RAND paper summarizes it, Russian disinformation operations have 4 general characteristics. They are: 1, they're high volume and multi-channel; 2, rapid, continuous, and repetitive; 3, and this might seem obvious, lack a commitment to objective reality; and 4, lack a commitment to consistency, even among the stories that they publish. Now, the Kremlin believes these methods are effective, which is why they keep funding them. The biggest change since the 2016 RAND study, of course, is the emergence and rapid evolution of AI and AI tools, which no doubt is a tremendous boon to that disinformation machine. So back to my story. When I arrived in Tashkent in 2019 and later in Astana in 2022, I wasn't surprised to see this fire hose of falsehood aimed at our embassy, at the US government, and even at me personally. I had seen versions of classic KGB info ops in previous State Department positions as far back as the late 1990s. And after 2 decades of reading absurd anti-US conspiracy theories in Russian media, I was fully prepared to see many carefully crafted stories about us during my time living in Central Asia. But what I didn't expect was the degree to which the outlandish stories being pumped into Central Asia were premised on the supposed gullibility of Uzbeks and Kazakhs. For instance, following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, we saw the reemergence of a familiar trope of Russian disinformation that concerns long-standing US initiatives to help former Soviet republics deal with the environmental and health consequences of the Soviet Union's biological weapons program. Russian disinformation claims that these US programs are actually just a sophisticated cover story, masking a secret American plot to develop new and ever deadlier pathogens to use as bioweapons. The Russian fake news factory churned out story after story in 2022, alleging that we had built dozens of these bioweapons facilities, especially in Ukraine, but also in Georgia, Armenia, and Kazakhstan. A new twist on the story, peaking around the time I arrived in Kazakhstan in November 2022, alleged that the American and Ukrainian governments had conspired to transfer more than a dozen of these biolabs from Ukraine to Kazakhstan, presumably to safeguard them from the prying eyes of Russian soldiers who were running around Ukraine at the time. Now, at my very first press conference in Astana in November of 2022, the Kazakh journalist asked me about these stories that were appearing in the press. In response, I first recounted 3 decades of fruitful partnership between the US and Kazakhstan to prevent proliferation of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, and to clean up the mess left over from the Soviet weapons of mass destruction complex. I stressed that when the Soviet Union broke up, newly independent Kazakhstan was essentially stuck with this legacy and had to do something with it. We were ready to help. I pointed out that the government of Kazakhstan had continued cooperating with us right up to that moment because they had seen the concrete positive results of past cooperation with their own eyes. And I concluded by saying that the assumption behind this Russian-produced disinformation campaign seemed to be that Kazakhs are idiots, easily duped, and not aware of their own best interests. Not only is this deeply insulting, I said, but it's also completely at odds with my own observation, which is that our Kazakh friends are highly aware of the pros and cons of every cooperative effort they undertake with the United States, and always acting in their own national interests, as they should. Now, a similar theme and similar tone ran through much of this malign anti-American propaganda put out by the Kremlin's information machine in Central Asia. And that is, not only are the Americans up to no good, cynically sowing chaos and destruction on a regular basis, but the Central Asian governments must either be unwitting pawns in an American game of chess, or worse, blinded by their own Russophobia into supporting US plots. A typical example of this occurred in October 2023, when I went to Almaty to visit the Kazakhstan Peace Operations Center, also known as KazCent. KazCent is a facility run by the Kazakh Ministry of Defense for the purpose of training troops who will be deployed for United Nations peacekeeping missions. Now, we and many other countries had supported KazCent over many years, and eventually it was formally certified by the UN as a provider of high-quality training for peacekeepers. Now, KazCent was about to open a new conference center that had been partly financed by the US Defense Department. To mark the occasion, the Kazakh Deputy Minister of Defense and I were there to cut a ceremonial ribbon. The next day, Russian media reported that the American ambassador to Kazakhstan had opened a brand new NATO training center in Almaty, presumably a beachhead for the eventual US invasion of Russia. These Russian media reports were so disturbing to the Kazakh government that the Ministry of Defense felt compelled to issue a statement clarifying that this new conference center was simply part of a Kazakh-run training center and had no NATO connection whatsoever. Now, while it's easy to joke about such an absurd idea, and I milked it for all it was worth every time for the next year that I met with someone in the Kazakh government, I would thank them for ensuring my next promotion, because of course, no other American diplomat had ever opened a NATO base in Central Asia. So of course I would be recognized for this. But despite the jokes aside, the intent behind such Russian information operations is deadly serious. The point is not to make people believe that NATO is about to open a training center in Kazakhstan, an obviously absurd idea to anyone who knows anything about Central Asia. But rather, the point is to consistently plant the idea that America is trying to destabilize Central Asia in order to weaken Russia. And if they plant enough seeds of suspicion, a few might germinate. The resulting seedlings might then grow into a field of doubt about American intentions and create fertile ground in which to cultivate further tales of US misdeeds. Ultimately, the Russian government hopes to drive a wedge between Central Asians and Americans, causing them to pull back from cooperation with us. It's worth emphasizing, as an aside, that my experience in Tashkent and Astana is by no means unique. For many years, American ambassadors and their embassies around the world have been subjected repeatedly to similar attacks aimed at discrediting their work and discrediting the country they represent. And by no means is Russia the only source of this information warfare. China, Iran, and others are actively engaged as well. But back to this particular case in Central Asia and Russia, what did we do is the question to deal with this fire hose of falsehood? Well, first, there's a perfectly normal human instinct to try responding to lies with the truth, to immediately rebut the false information. And that was my initial inclination, until I was advised by my very experienced public affairs team that this would very likely be counterproductive. By directly answering the lies, they explained, you risk breathing new life into false stories that might otherwise die a quiet death, as many of them did. Instead, our general approach was to systematically put out as much information as possible about the many positive things the United States was doing, always in partnership with Uzbek or Kazakh government, private sector, or non-governmental organizations to improve the lives of Uzbek and Kazakh citizens. For example, our exchanges and training programs were helping farmers and entrepreneurs to be more productive and grow their businesses. Our health programs were protecting people in these countries against infectious diseases like TB and HIV/AIDS. And during the COVID pandemic, delivering life-saving protective equipment, ventilators, and vaccines. Our cooperation with Uzbek and Kazakh military and law enforcement agencies was improving capacity to protect these nations from outside threats. Our educational partnerships and scholarships were giving young people the opportunity to learn English and study sometimes at amazing US universities. And private US companies, by making investments and transferring skills and technologies, we're creating good jobs for Uzbek and Kazakh workers while moving local industry up the value chain. We had tons of success stories to talk about. The idea was to build a positive image of the United States that would essentially serve to inoculate the public against the fake narratives being served up by the Russian state media and its proxies in Central Asia. And here's something else we did that I think was super important. We demonstrated daily by speaking the national languages and showing our interest in local history and tradition, America's deep respect for the cultural and political sovereignty of these independent nations. That provided a stark contrast to what Kazakhs and Uzbeks saw coming out of Russia, especially after the invasion of Ukraine in February 22. Prominent Russian pundits and government officials became increasingly hysterical in condemning supposed signs of Russophobia in Central Asia, while Russian commentators were decrying moves to rename streets after national heroes rather than Soviet historical figures. We were celebrating Uzbek and Kazakh cultural traditions. While Russian officials were condemning legal changes promoting more usage of the Uzbek or Kazakh language as anti-Russian, we made videos showing American English teachers living in cities around Uzbekistan reciting Alisher Navoi's poems in Uzbek. One of our most popular social media posts when I was in Kazakhstan was a two-part video that followed me as I drove around Astana, or was driven around Astana, actually. I wasn't allowed to drive when I was there, finding streets named for significant Kazakh historical figures and stopping along the way to taste local street food. U.S. Embassy Uzbekistan and U.S. Embassy Kazakhstan's positive narratives reached local audiences because we had effective tools. Our biggest asset was the Embassy Public Affairs Division, staffed by Americans and locally hired professionals who knew how to reach local audiences in a compelling way. Our second biggest asset was all those assistance and exchange programs I was talking about, which were demonstrably benefiting these countries and their citizens. At the same time, we hoped that each country over time would develop a healthier, more diverse internal media ecosystem. This would serve, we thought, as an antidote to the Russian poison. Ideally, local media outlets staffed by professionally trained journalists, reporting without fear or favor, would do the hard work of rooting out phony stories based on made-up facts. More rigorous fact-checking would create an inhospitable climate for disinformation. And we also hoped that their readers, the citizens of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, would become more sophisticated media consumers, able to discern fake from real news. Now, to be honest, I'm not sure how realistic some of these goals are in the United States today, let alone in Central Asia. Nonetheless, through State Department and USAID programs, we supported a number of trainings, exchanges, and grant programs aimed at increasing the professionalism of journalists and expanding the number of independent media voices. We sponsored a very popular English for Journalists program to help local journalists get access to English language information sources. Meanwhile, other efforts sought to improve media literacy in the broader public. And all the evidence I saw over 6 years in the region was that this set of programs was having a limited but undeniably positive impact. And finally, there was one other tool in the US toolkit worth noting, although this one wasn't wielded by our diplomatic team. I'm talking about the US-funded media outlets producing content that was widely read and viewed inside both Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, namely the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, RFERL. I and my embassy colleagues had almost no ability to influence these outlets. By design and by statute, a wall exists between their editorial decision-making and our authority as representatives of the President and Secretary of State. And yet, we knew that VOA and RFERL would provide balanced reporting about the United States, not sugar-coated coverage, but an objective portrayal of events standing in sharp contrast to the garbage flowing from the Russian Firehose. While far from a perfect weapon, it was an effective tool for combating the information attacks being waged against us. And now, today, bring us up to today, 8 months into the second Trump administration, it seems clear that the information war is over in Central Asia. Not because the Russians won, we have simply surrendered. We have unilaterally disarmed by shutting down USAID and gutting most of the rest of our popular assistance programs, severely limiting our ability to provide tangible evidence of how we contribute to Central Asia's prosperity and security. We are decimating the ranks of our experienced public diplomacy professionals. When 1,300 State Department, foreign, and civil service officers were summarily and arbitrarily dismissed in July, just a couple months ago, a disproportionate number of those fired were experts in public outreach and media relations. The administration is also moving toward yet another self-amputation as it seeks to chop off 2 more effective limbs of US soft power, VOA and RFERL. All programs to support independent media or trained journalists have been eliminated in the region, and we will no longer be promoting media literacy among the citizens of Central Asia. I have even heard reports from people I know that the word disinformation itself has been banished from US government discourse. Is there a chance any of this will be reversed? Even as a committed optimist, a lifelong optimist, I must admit the signs are not encouraging at the moment. In April, Secretary of State Rubio published an op-ed piece in an online publication called The Federalist, in which he trumpeted recent actions to shut down something called the Global Engagement Center. Most people never heard of this entity, but this was the State Department office that was tasked during the Obama, first Trump, and Biden administrations with undertaking practical measures to address the problem of malign foreign propaganda. The secretary described the elimination of this office as some sort of great victory for democracy, claiming that it, quote, nearly destroyed America's long history of free speech, and accusing previous Democratic administrations with, quote, weaponizing it to censor conservative voices. As far as I can tell, the evidence presented for this assertion is exceptionally thin, but I'm not interested in debating that question because it completely misses the point. Far more important is what Secretary Rubio's article did not say. This was the Secretary's first and only public statement to date about foreign information manipulation. And it contained zero acknowledgement, this is a serious problem that needs to be addressed, zero discussion of how information attacks threaten our foreign policy interests, and zero new strategic and programmatic ideas. He might as well have ended the article with an emoji showing a big white surrender flag. Meanwhile, the Russian government, through its state-controlled media, continues to wage an information war against our country. Nobody is coming home in body bags in this war, but there are real casualties. Namely, our country's reputation, the effectiveness of our diplomatic representatives, and our ability to persuade other nations to work with us in pursuit of critical national interests. A disparaged and discredited America will be a weak America, with a greatly reduced ability to advance its global priorities. I sincerely hope it will not take another 3.5 years before our country rearms itself and begins once again pushing back on the relentless information attacks against us in Central Asia and around the world. Because the longer we wait, the weaker will be our ability to tell our own story to the world and to have the world believe us. And a world where someone else tells our story is not a world where America can thrive. Thank you.
Right, I am the aforementioned Claire Rosine, and I just want to start by thanking you for being here, not just this afternoon, but over the course of a couple of days. You've been spending a lot of time with our faculty, our students, our administrators, and it's been really a pleasure to have you here. I also want to take a moment to commend the student organizers in Asian Crossroads, Jamin, Umid, Dana, and Ella in particular for your hard work and your professionalism. It's been really amazing from start to finish how this event has come together, and I just want to thank you all for all that you've been doing. Okay, so I want to begin with kind of a broad question. I also I think there's such an amazing turnout today in person, and I'm hearing 35 to 40 people also on Zoom. So I'm sure there are many intelligent questions in the audience. So I'm going to try not to take up too much time myself. But I want to start with sort of some broad, a couple broad questions. So your talk this afternoon has been mostly retrospective. Right, you've been describing your experience over the past 6 years or more than 6 years as an ambassador in Uzbekistan, then in Kazakhstan. Describing your priorities in that role to help Central Asian governments and their partnerships with the United States, and also in your role as sort of the chief combating of disinformation, and the so-called Firehose of Russian disinformation. But I'd like to ask you to begin our discussion this afternoon by looking forward. Given your deep experience in the region, and your familiarity with US and Central Asian and Russian foreign policy, I want to ask for your thoughts about where you see things going from here. So first, even before this year's transformations and the new administration, the second Trump administration, the war in Ukraine was shaking up both Central Asian relationships with Russia, and Central Asian republics' relationships to each other and to the rest of the world. The new US administration and its shift in approach only adds further instability, I think, to the situation. So amidst all of this instability and transformation, How do you see Central Asian governments changing both the way they relate to one another within the region and the ways that it's been mediated in different ways by these foreign governments as well? So their intra-regional ties. And in the face of instability from two major historic interlocutors, Russia and the United States, where do you think they will turn next when it comes to regional and international partners?
Fantastic question, Claire. Thank you. And there's a lot of different directions I could take it, I think, but I'll try to stick to a couple. I mean, one thing that I learned from my time in the region, and in addition to the 6 years serving there at embassies, I also had spent 4 or 5 years in Washington just working on the five countries of Central Asia, and talking to many government officials, researchers, NGO activists, and sort of getting a feel for the way they viewed the outside world. And one thing that was very clear, and especially from the government side, is that all these Central Asian states, I mean, Kazakhstan in some ways is the master of it, I would say, but they all practice some form of what the Kazakhs call the multi-vector foreign policy. And this is all about finding that balance that allows them to truly exercise sovereignty and make their own decisions about what's in their own country's best interest, while not antagonizing or even, provoking some kind of conflict with anyone, especially their big neighbors, Russia and China, but more broadly, getting along with the rest of the world and taking the best they can from different regions, different countries. I think on the whole, they've actually done a remarkable job of walking that line over the years. And I think if anything, what you laid out as the current situation drives them to do that even more carefully and more, sort of diligently. I do think that to the extent that the United States retreats or pulls back because of cutting our diplomatic presence or obviously our assistance and our exchanges and things like that, what will fill that vacuum is more engagement with others, and especially with their neighbors. I think that it's almost inevitable. So to the extent that we are part of the balance, I fear that we're going to just be less of a vector. We won't, of those many vectors, we will become a lesser one over time if this continues, if this trend continues. But another trend that's been very clear in recent years, and I think it's a very positive one, which is part of how the Central Asian countries respond to these challenges, is, and you alluded to this, is this intra-regional integration, cooperation. I was very lucky, I think, in many ways, to be part of a big effort in that direction when I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary in 2015, when we started something called the C5+1, a diplomatic platform that was begun in Samarkand with Secretary John Kerry going there. But it was part of a 5-country trip. He actually visited all 5 countries on that trip, met with all the presidents. And the idea is to have the 5 foreign ministers of the countries meet with the US Secretary of State to discuss common interests. And we tried to turn it into more than just a talk shop by having initiatives under the C5+1 that related to particular common challenges the region faced. One was, for example, on trade and how do you facilitate trade across borders? Because at the time, I think this is still true, but less so than in 2015, the amount of trade within the region was dwarfed by trade with partners to the east, north, and even south. It was remarkable. The percentage of all, I think it was like the percentage of GDP accounted for by trade within the region on the whole it was under 5%. And when you think of the fact that there's actually a lot of complementarity within Central Asia in terms of what countries produce, that there's something wrong with that. So there was a focus on trade. There was a focus on water, sharing of water resources, which are increasingly scarce. There was a focus on energy, a focus on security cooperation. We did all this under the C5+1. But the real purpose of having this format, which by the way was not unique to the United States, the Japanese did it, the first one, about 10 years before we did, the C5+1. South Korea did it after Japan, and then the EU. So we were fourth in line. And since we did ours, everyone has jumped on the bandwagon. Russia, China, India, Germany, Italy, they all have their C5+1s. I think it's a little overwhelming, frankly, for the foreign ministries of these Central Asian countries. They have to deal, I think they have 12 of these now. So you can imagine that's like one a month. They're dealing with these big international meetings. It's too much. But the purpose from our standpoint was not that we could say, oh, we have this great format with the Central Asians. It was to promote and encourage them to talk to each other more and cooperate with each other more. And I'm not saying we get the credit for having done this, but the fact is that within a year or two after we started ours, they started meeting at the presidential level, having annual summits of the C5. As I used to joke with the Uzbek foreign minister, Abdulaziz Kamilov, and I became pretty good friends during the time I was there, good colleagues and friends. And I used to joke with him, I'd say, Mr. Minister, what you need is C5s with no pluses and no minuses, like just C5. And he agreed with me. Anyway, they did this, they had these summit meetings, and now they're trying to institutionalize it and turn it into something more permanent, sort of like the ASEAN organization that operates in Southeast Asia, or the Nordic Council, the Nordic countries, and something that is more ongoing and promotes their own cooperation. And of course, the premise of all this is if they stand with each other and support each other, they will be stronger vis-a-vis the countries around them. They can stand up more strongly.
I mean, the question that immediately comes to mind for me when you talk about the C5 is another regional domain of flux, which is Afghanistan. Afghanistan obviously has been in a major transition over the past couple of years with the US withdrawal. And Uzbekistan in particular seems to be moving toward normalizing relations with Afghanistan. So, if we're talking about the C5, what do you make of Afghanistan and its relationship to the post-Soviet, republics of Central Asia?
So this has been a topic of discussion from the beginning of the C5, because in 2015, we were still in the midst of the height of our involvement in Afghanistan, the United States was. And in many respects, we viewed the Central Asian countries as part of the solution to the problem of Afghanistan. So we were trying to promote more trade, especially with Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. We were trying to get the Central Asians to help us to, talk to different factions within Central Asia, because of course there's a large Tajik community, there's a large Uzbek community in Afghanistan. And there was a period before 2021 when we withdrew, when there was actually serious talk about making it a C6+1 to include Afghanistan. And the Central Asians were somewhat receptive to that. Now, once the Taliban took over, of course, that was off the table. But you're right that there's been a pronounced trend. Actually, it started right after the Taliban came in, but it's intensified recently, of the Central Asian countries, especially the neighboring countries, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, finding ways to promote ties with the Afghan government, trying to stay within the parameters of non-recognition, because they still haven't officially recognized the Taliban government, but doing everything but officially recognize, even accrediting some diplomats that the Taliban has sent to their countries. And the reasons, many Americans don't like it. And we had, objections or people saying, well, you need to go in and talk to the Kazakhs or the Uzbeks and tell them, stop it, you're going too far. And the fact is, they have very practical, pragmatic reasons for wanting to pursue that. They view instability in Afghanistan as a huge threat to them, security-wise. And they also view Afghanistan, especially the Uzbeks, this is true of, as part of their connection to the outside world, potentially. So there's been a lot of talk in recent years, I won't go too far down this road, of building the East-West connections, the China to Europe going through Central Asia and building out that corridor, that trade corridor. Well, the Uzbeks would really dearly want to build a railroad and road line that goes through Afghanistan into Pakistan and goes to the ports in Pakistan, the Gwadar port in Pakistan. And that is, President Mirziyoyev, it's like his dream project. And he'd been trying forever. It's very difficult because security situation is not great in Afghanistan. There's not enough money for it right now. The World Bank doesn't want to get involved because of the Taliban government. So there are a lot of obstacles, but that's the way the Central Asians view Afghanistan. Not that it's just a problem, but it's actually a solution to things they've been, the challenges that they've faced for a long time.
So this I think is actually a sort of organic way to bring in the sort of other sort of looming figure in the very complex relations that Central Asian republics have to each other and to the outside world. We've been talking a lot about the US, we've been talking about Russia, and China's just come up in passing. But China is obviously a very important player in this kind of multilateral negotiation. And you've talked at length about Russian disinformation, but in these days, in both recent administrations, I mean, Rubio has been historically very outspoken about China. So we've been hearing a lot more anxiety about Chinese disinformation and more broadly about Chinese influence in Central Asia. The Belt and Road Initiative is one of the major things I would say that brings students to my classes on Central Asian history and culture. A lot of students, when they say why they're there, they're interested in China. I was just looking this morning at a recent poll or a sort of series of polls conducted across multiple different republics in Central Asia by Central Asia Policy Studies, CAPS. Since 2017, they've been polling public opinion toward China among the Central Asian republics, and then breaking it down, public opinion toward Chinese technology, Chinese energy and infrastructure projects. There are some fluctuations, but the general trend seems to be that public opinion toward China, especially in Uzbekistan, but to varying degrees in most other, in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkmenistan as well, is pretty favorable. So, what is the draw of the Belt and Road for Central Asia's governments? How do the programs in the Belt and Road Initiative compare to the types of US initiatives you were promoting as an ambassador in the region? Ties with US businesses and US capital. If I'm a Central Asian entrepreneur or business person or worker or diplomat, what are my considerations in thinking about our relationship to China versus the US and Russia these days?
So again, excellent question that is got many layers to it, and we won't get to all of them, I'm sure. But so just picking up on your last comment about attitudes towards China in Central Asia, there was a time, 20 years ago when a lot of people were saying, well, China will never succeed in really breaking into Central Asia in a big way because there's this inherent distrust of China, and there's a lot of xenophobia. And I remember when I first got to Kazakhstan, having a roundtable that my consulate, we have a consulate in Almaty, and the consulate set up a roundtable of Kazakh China scholars, so people who specialize in China in Kazakhstan. And I asked them this question about what's the current state of attitudes. And I want to look at this set of surveys that you were talking about that CAPS did, but they said it's very generational. Like the older generation tends to still harbor the skepticism or even fear or distrust of China based on some historical things that happened, maybe even from the Soviet period, but also, some of the early moves China made into the region were maybe not done so skillfully and maybe a little in a heavy-handed way. But the younger generation, and maybe it's partly through technology and TikTok or whatever, and partly through more exposure because there's a lot more young students from Central Asia studying in China now, and there's a lot more language learning going on. China has built a set of these Confucius centers around the country. I remember, just as an anecdote, visiting Samarkand in probably around maybe 2021 to it was called the Institute of Foreign Languages in Samarkand, which is, I think, the preeminent foreign language institute in the country. And we had an American English teacher based there through we had this thing called the English Language Fellows Program. I don't know if we still have it, but we had this program. And they were, the rector was so grateful to have this Native American, English speaker there. And, all the students wanted to sign up for his classes and engage. And as we were walking down the hall, I saw this hallway off to the side that had Chinese flags in it. And I asked him, what's that about? And he said, oh, well, there's a Confucius Center there, and we have 14 Mandarin teachers that China has sent us for our institute. And he said it's a little out of whack because we only have, they might have had 750 students studying English and only 200 studying Mandarin. I don't know if those numbers are exact, but roughly that was the ratio. But they only had this one American and they had 14 Chinese. But it demonstrated to me how serious China is about promoting its interests and using soft power. That's classic soft power, right? So anyway, yeah, attitudes are changing and becoming more positive. And I think it's from the government standpoint, what you were saying earlier about, these unreliable and sort of shaky partners like Russia or the United States, what do? How do they respond? What I didn't say in my answer is one of their responses is to move closer to China, because they view China as being as reliable, as predictable. They kind of know what China's about. They know that maybe some of the things that China wants to do are more in China's self-interest, but they can benefit from those things. And finally, to your question specifically about BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, and all the projects under that, I can say, as a US official, I often had to talk about how Chinese investment and projects is, not done, according to international standards, or, doesn't hire enough local labor, saddles countries with debt sometimes, and they have this debt trap thing, and a bunch of other reasons why it's bad or not in their interest. And frankly, a lot of that it was true, and some of it still is true. I'm not saying it wasn't, but the fact is, I saw with my own eyes that China was doing a pretty good job of winning friends and influencing people in the Central Asian countries. And all you have to do is, drive through the tunnel that connects Tashkent with Fergana Valley. It's like a 12-kilometer long tunnel built by China that cut down the trip to the Fergana Valley from like 4 hours to 2 hours or something like that by train, or drive on the highway that the Chinese built between Dushanbe and Panjshir, on the western border of Tajikistan. Beautiful, four-lane highway, and on. I could, cite like half dozen examples of these infrastructure projects that were well done and actually demonstrably benefited these countries. So I don't want to sound like I'm like, Mr. China booster here or anything, but just the reality is that the Central Asians have reason to move closer to China, to trade more with China, and to accept these projects.
Yeah, as I was preparing for our conversation, I was revisiting some of the coverage from the Central Asia China Summit that happened this summer, June 17th in Astana, where it seemed like the messaging, Xi Jinping was there in person, stressing the reliability of China, sort of implicitly dinging other potential international partners, sort of emphasizing mutual trust and support, equal relations, green energy. In his speech, he said something about promoting an equal and orderly multipolar world, and all the implications that come with that. I think thinking about China and the US with relation to Central Asia, as well as sort of public opinion within Central Asia, just anecdotally, my own sort of friends and interlocutors in the region, watching people on social media, both with relation to China and with relation to the US, there are these global developments that also seem to be really affecting public opinion toward each of these places, so the ongoing repression of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, for example, is something that's widely discussed or widely, deeply felt among many of my colleagues in Central Asia, even if their governments are reticent to bring these things up.
Reticent is putting it mildly, actually. Yes, yes.
And sort of similarly, the U.S. government's prosecution of the war in Gaza has become sort of increasingly something that I'm seeing coming across my social media feeds. So I'm curious how you would comment on the sort of global interconnectedness of Central Asia, and also the sort of online media universe that relates to not only the US and China and their designs for Central Asia, but sort of more broadly, networks of solidarity among, whether it's Turkic people and Uyghurs who live across the borders, or Muslims in Gaza and in Central Asia.
Yeah, so you come up with the big issues here. These are big sweeping issues, but really important ones. So yeah, I mean, the first of all, as someone from a different generation, and I'm not as kind of comfortable swimming in the sea of social media as people younger than me. And I was, I had to be dragged kicking and screaming into having my own Instagram account when I was in Kazakhstan, because everyone uses Instagram in Kazakhstan and gets, a lot of information. So I did eventually, succumb to that. But I was fascinated and really interested when I was there in both countries in learning what was going on in the social media space. And I was very fortunate to have really talented people. I referred in my speech to our public affairs professionals, especially the local staff, who were so plugged into that stuff and saw the trends and the conversations that were going on and tried to incorporate that into what we did in our outreach and in our social media products, basically. And I think it's really important for the U.S. government or any government who wants to understand these countries to delve into that and really see what's going on in that space. One of the interesting conversations that we were tracking closely and trying to meet people who were part of it was about national identity building, and actually the word that was being used more and more in Kazakhstan when I was there was decolonization. Mm-hmm. This idea of like shedding the colonial mentality or something like that. And that was a controversial word, and some people were reluctant to use it because it was seen as provocative. But in fact, some of the young people who were having these conversations, in some cases even like creating their own podcasts and things like that, were very serious about that word, decolonization. And this is actually a good example of how you strategize about how to communicate with the country that you're in, and where you put your emphasis. So it was, to be honest, we tread carefully because I wanted to understand that conversation and see who was talking about it and how influential it was in society. But I realized there were limits of how much we should try to exploit it, in a sense, right? And use it as going back to something I said in my speech, that like the US, we understand how you feel, right? And yeah, you should be. And of course, decolonization, it's really about, shedding, distancing yourself from Russia, ultimately. But that would have been counterproductive, I think, had we gone in so heavy on that. So instead, we just tried to keep it straightforward. Like, as I said, like, we respect your tradition and your desire to create a distinct national identity, and we want to understand it better and learn about it because it's part of a proud historical legacy and great, literature and poetry and music and all these other things. So let's celebrate that, but not put it into this context of you're trying to decolonize and that's why you're doing this, and we, hooray, hooray kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that's just one example of how the social media conversation influenced what we did and kind of informed our interaction with society.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm sensitive again to the fact that there are a lot of questions in the audience. And so I'm going to just conclude with one last question, which is a question I was actually kind of ambivalent about asking because, you know, and you stressed this, I think, also in your talk that, you know, as an ambassador to Uzbekistan and then Kazakhstan, you were invested in building bilateral relations with these countries and not seeing them as a sort of pathway to Russia or a way, or you know, a way of getting at Russia's soft underbelly or something like that. But you found yourself being sucked into a role where you were forced to triangulate with Russia. Would you agree with that representation?
How do you mean triangulate with Russia? Maybe.
Well, you know, to be attuned to U.S.-Russian relations in the way that you're interacting with Central Asia.
Well, yes, yeah. I mean, we definitely couldn't ignore the context of our relationship with Russia at all. I mean, it was very much a part of what was going on. And I think, you know, well, so what really came front and center and occupied much of my time there that related to the triangulation was sanctions. So I spent an enormous amount of time after February 2022, first with the government of Uzbekistan and then government of Kazakhstan, figuring out how to both encourage them or to influence them, you know, convince them it was in their interest to observe the sanctions or not become a what's the word, a platform for circumvention of sanctions. And so that was, of course, the only reason why that was important was because we were prosecuting this struggle to help Ukraine and to weaken Russia economically, and the Central Asians were key to that. And so, and frankly, you know, particularly in Kazakhstan, I think the Kazakh government did a pretty good job of living by President Tokayev's pledge that he made right at the beginning of the war, which was that Kazakhstan would not be a platform for avoiding the sanctions.
Yeah.
There was leakage then. There's probably more leakage now, frankly, but you know, on the whole, they worked with us really closely, and not just us, but the EU as well. So that was, I don't know if that's what you had in mind with your question.
Well, I mean, I don't want to make our conversation about Central Asia a conversation about Russia, but I given your involvement in these conversations, I'm just again looking forward to the future, given the sort of recent gutting of diplomacy as it has been practiced really since the mid-1940s, arguably. Where do you see Russia-US relations going from here?
Nowhere good. I can't see. I mean, I don't want to get too deeply into analyzing President Trump's psychology and his relationship with Putin and all that, which, you know, is ad infinitum. We can go to our own media and commentary to learn about that, although a lot of it's speculation. I made it clear that I disagree with the policy approach, especially more broadly on how soft power is part of what U.S. should be doing in the world, and also in terms of our support for Ukraine in its war against Russia. So I'm clear about that, but I guess I don't see U.S.-Russian relations warming and improving, notwithstanding President Trump's clear desire to have a good relationship with Putin, despite everything, you know, wanting to continue that relationship. I see too many just fundamental obstacles to that happening that relate to core U.S. national security interests. And so as long as Putin is in power, certainly as long as the war continues in Ukraine, I don't see any kind of breakthrough or, you know, positive turn in U.S.-Russian relations. That's my take. But, you know, you can check me a year from now or 2 years from now and see how well my prediction bore out.
All right, I think it's a good time to